Salofalava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Suiswiki. Coming up,
you can collect water and to some degree you can identify without seeing the actual organism from their DNA in the water.
an expedition is underway in Tuvalu. Also, what does it take to save white-tip sharks in the Pacific? And
we invest in our children and in our older age. There's an expectation that they will look after their parents.
improving retirement literacy for Pacific women. It's been another week of politicking in the Solomon Islands. Prime Minister Jeremiah Manele yesterday survived another challenge to his leadership. The motion of no confidence brought by Gordon Darcy Lilo last week didn't make it to the floor, despite being set for the day. Te Wila Fortai spoke to Associate Professor from the University of Hawaii's Department of Pacific Island Studies, Tarsisius Kabutaulaka, following yesterday's events.
I think the first and important thing for our listeners to know is that this is not new in Solomon Islands. We have had similar incidents in the past. And of course, motions of no confidence is something really familiar to people in Solomon Islands, and including, other places like Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu. And so this is not particularly new. In fact, Gordon Darcy Lilo moved the motion of no confidence in December 2024 and then withdrew it. And today, as we saw in Parliament, the motion was again withdrawn after discussions with the Speaker to the National Parliament, Patterson Orty. And so this is something that a lot of Solomon Islanders and people in other Melanesian countries, particularly Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, are quite familiar with.
So, can we take any indications from these events about the stability of Manele's leadership at the moment?
Well, the stability of government in Solomon Islands can never be guaranteed. As we've seen in the last 1 year of Manele's term in office, anybody can move a motion of no confidence and people can shift allegiances. And part of the reason is that, despite the Political Integrity Act that Solomon Islands has, members of parliament, particularly those in independent as well as, other members of parliament who belong to political parties, can still resign and join other political parties. But what we've seen in the last week is that members of parliament shifting from one side of the house to the other and then shifting back to government again. Not all of them, of course. There are some, including the former Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare and the former Deputy Prime Minister Manasseh Mailanga, who are now in the opposition.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peter Chanel, suggested that the government adopt something similar to what they do in Papua New Guinea, where new governments get sort of an 18-month grace period from motions of no confidence. What do you think of that?
That can be done, but there is no guarantee that after 18 months you would have stability. The other option is what they put in place in Vanuatu, where if you leave your political party, you lose your parliamentary seat and therefore to have a by-election. And that discourages members of parliament from leaving. But as we've seen in the case of Vanuatu as well, that members of parliament find loopholes in these things, hence the snap election that they had in Vanuatu after the earthquake. I think these are structural issues that we could look at both legislation as well as the Constitution and see if there are amendments in the Constitution as well as amendments in acts of Parliament that could guarantee stability. And unless that is done, in the case of Solomon Islands, I think we cannot guarantee that the Manele government will be stable for the next 3 years. The other interesting thing in the recent case in Solomon Islands is the intergenerational difference amongst politicians. I think what we are seeing is that there is a new generation of Solomon Islands politicians who are emerging, and perhaps over time are going to marginalize the older politicians like Manasseh Sogovare and Gordon Darcy Lilo and Matthew Wale, who have been in Parliament for a very long time.
I think that'd be very interesting. Those are some major personalities you're talking about, sort of fading away.
Yeah, and so I mean we've seen people like Paul Bosawai Popora, the member of Parliament for North Guadalcanal, who is Minister for Health, and then we've seen a group of younger politicians who were in the opposition had moved to government. People like Derek Manuari, John Tuhaika, and the member of Parliament for North Malaita. And so a lot of what we saw last week is about personalities, particular individuals with very assertive and sometimes abrasive personality in Parliament that we are beginning to see people move away from them. And I don't think they will change, but I think people around them will begin to realize that politics and things cannot be done only in those aggressive and very abrasive ways.
An expedition in Tuvalu's waters is using a submersible to study the ocean. The expedition is a partnership between National Geographic Pristine Seas and the Tuvalu government. Expedition leader Kieran Fraser says they'll be deploying a range of scientific equipment in the sea, and the tech will help them get an idea of the health of the ocean in that area. He spoke to Christina Persico.
The leg we're on at the moment is a deep sea leg, so a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is centered around our submersible, the Argonauta, and that's a 3-person submersible which is rated to go down to 1,300 meters, so pretty deep. We can put scientists in that with a driver to record scientific observations, count fish, look for species and things like that. We also use what's called BRUVs, so baited remote underwater videos, and the idea of these is that you put them in the water and basically they record what species turn up. They've got a bait count on them. Various organisms in the area smell the scent of the bait and come to the cameras, and then from that you can work out what species live in that area and to some degree the density of them, so you get an idea of the health of the ocean in that area. So really, really important. And then the last tool we're using on this leg is drop cams, which are these very deep water cameras which can be dropped down to depths of 6,000 meters. And again, they're baited, and it allows us to collect data on what lives in the deep sea in these areas. We're also carrying out bird surveys on this expedition as well, really. There's going to be a second expedition to Tuvalu, which is going to start when we finish this one at the end of the month. And on that one, there'll be scientific diving, so looking at fish distributions using a technique called underwater visual census, and species that live on the bottom, such as coral, invertebrates, so things like sea cucumbers. And alongside of that, we're also doing interviews with both scientists from the local communities on the ships and also people within the community. And that could be various senior people within the community, people who are much younger, fishermen, anybody really who's got a story to tell. So, I mean, the documentaries we're making is not so much about National Geographic at all, about the Pristine Seas programme. It's about the science and it's about telling the stories of those communities.
So for you, what is the overall goal of this expedition? What do you hope to have achieved at the end of it?
The area we're working in is fairly unexplored. In some of the shallower waters, there's been some really good work done on scientific diving, shallow water surveys on fish and corals and things. But certainly in the area we're working for the next month in the deep sea, there's been, I'm pretty sure, next to nothing done. The Argo, which is the ship that I'm sat on, is a very unusual vessel in that we've got the capability to work well into the deep sea on a very, very small vessel. She's only 40 meters long. So the sort of data that we're collecting will help the Tuvalu government and the communities understand what lives in their seas and identify areas which are really sort of prime for protection.
Each year, scientists from around the Pacific gather to discuss protection and management of the oceanic white-tip sharks through the SPC or Pacific Community, the region's scientific and technical agency. Fisheries scientist Phil Nabawa was at this year's meeting in March in Noumea, New Caledonia. He spoke with Te Wila Futai about the meeting and started by telling her about his work in the Pacific region.
Our team at Dragonfly, we work quite closely with the SPC and with the Pacific Community, who are headquartered in Noumea. And so they have a fisheries stock assessment team that every year assesses a range of the tuna species in the Western Pacific. And so we're contracted to them on an annual basis at the moment to do fisheries stock assessments for bycatch species, so mainly sharks.
And why is that something that's particularly valuable for the Pacific?
So I guess overall the tuna industry is a pretty massive one for a lot of the island nations in the Pacific, and it's a massive contribution to the island economy. And I guess a lot of the tuna species have had problems with shark bycatch over the years, and so there's the economic aspect of the tunas, obviously, but then there's also the ecological aspect of trying to understand first of all what the impact is on the shark species that the tuna fisheries interact with, and then trying to understand whether there are management options, for example, and when those are implemented, whether those management options actually work in terms of conservation of shark species. So what SPC do in March every year is they put on a meeting, which is, I guess, slightly informal in terms of that broader agenda of managing the tuna species. But what they try to do is get all the regional scientists together who work in that area and who contribute to the science and the management of the tuna species and associated species like sharks. Basically, try and give a show and tell of what they're doing in terms of the science of assessing these species, and so we contribute to that. And then try and get feedback from the regional scientists and from the individual countries as well, where that's possible to get feedback on, for example, the data collection and some of the science that we're doing.
What were the key takeaways from the March meeting?
These meetings are somewhat informal in that we tend to discuss the science and some of the priorities. And so, for example, for us, we're at the moment we're looking at oceanic white-tip sharks, and they are the species that is of most concern in the Pacific. And so I guess one of the things that we're urged to look at is whether we can see, for example, any signs of recent increases following management action about a decade ago, and whether that's starting to show up in the data. There was a lot of discussion around what we can and can't see from these data sets, and whether we might be able to see some rebound of the species, which has been pretty greatly affected by tuna fisheries over the decades, and so there's some hope that, for example, the management measures put in about a decade ago to stop harvesting of those oceanic white-tip shark species, that they will lead to a rebound of that species. And so what we'll try and do over the next couple of months basically is try and figure out whether we can see any signals for that in the data, or whether it looks like that species is still at a very low level and struggling to recover.
Has there been a level of recognition among the Pacific nations that are part of these meetings, or that SPC works with, that there needs to be control measures around the white-tip shark?
Yeah, so I guess when that species was first assessed, well over a decade ago now, it was already recognized that it was probably in a pretty poor state, and as a result, the WCPFC as a whole put in a non-retention measure. So it meant that these sharks weren't allowed to be brought on board or retained as catch, either for shark finning at the time, or as a whole catch, and especially a lot of the island nations have have put in shark fishing bans in their EEZs, and so for most national waters now, there's a strict non-retention or measure or retention ban on sharks in tuna fisheries. And I guess what we're seeing is that that seems to have an effect, especially on some of the species that are a bit more productive. We're starting to see those species really rebound, for example.
For Pacific nations, why is it important that we ensure conservation of the white tip shark?
I guess all of the shark species, they have an ecological role, but there's also a sort of big cultural significance in a lot of island nations, and I guess that role that the big sharks play as the apex predator it's a really important one to conserve in terms of trying to maintain healthy ecosystems and ultimately maintain the balance that allows, for example, the tuna fisheries and other fisheries to happen in healthy ecosystems, and that's an important part both culturally but also economically in terms of trying to maintain these ecosystems in a state where they are healthy and productive.
Retirement benefits are essential for women across the Pacific as they age. However, there are a number of barriers that prevent them from accessing these benefits. The Women in Super Network is wanting to change all that by improving Pacific women's retirement literacy and addressing institutional, social and regulatory challenges. I spoke with the Treasurer Laumanu Mafi to talk more about the work that the network is doing in the region.
Malo Susana and Ma'ofanga Malie. Thank you for the opportunity. So the network, Women in Super, was formally launched in late 2022. It brings together representatives from across the Pacific to share ideas, experiences and solutions tailored specifically for women and the challenges that they've faced in accessing retirement funds. It was launched in late 2022 at the PIF CEO Forum that was hosted by the New Zealand Super Fund here in Auckland. For context, PIF is a regional network of superannuation funds across 12 Pacific countries, and it provides a platform for collaboration, education and co-investment. And so PFDI presented a report at that CEO Forum here in Auckland outlining the results from a diagnostic study that revealed women had limited access to retirement benefits. And so following that, the CEO approved the launch of the Women in Super initiative to try and tackle those challenges.
How many Pacific countries did you study in order to identify the limitations to retirement accessibility?
So PFDI's report, if I recall correctly, was across 8 of the Pacific Island countries, mainly focused on Vanuatu, Tonga, Solomon Islands and PNG.
Because there's a lack of retirement literacy among women in the Pacific, how do they typically get by once they stop working?
So I think there's still very strong support networks. We women generally rely on their children as their retirement. We invest in our children, and in our older age, there's an expectation that they will look after their parents in their older age, and so they are getting by relying on what limited funds they did have, government support, but mainly on family members there.
Are we trying to encourage women in the Pacific to not rely on their children so much once they retire?
Yes, so just giving them the tools and the knowledge to take control of their financial futures. It's not bad to rely on your children, but also just giving them the chance to have their own independence here and to reduce poverty risk and support their journey towards financial independence, really.
Well, why is there an effort to promote equal access to retirement benefits in the Pacific when wages are typically low?
Well, evidence from the study showed that, yes, wages were typically low, but women had even lower wages. And so in their later years, they experienced more difficulty in terms of finances when compared to their male counterparts. And we think that dealing with these challenges that women face will just contribute to economic prosperity really overall.
What's been some of the highlights or achievements that the network's been doing?
So since 2022, we've had 2 surveys. The first one carried out in 2023 was sort of just to try and establish a baseline of where retirement funds were at the time. And since then, we had another survey in 2025, and that's shown significant improvement. We had 3 focus areas for the network, which was to improve gender disaggregated data collection. It was to increase engagement within the informal sector, because there were more women in the informal sector as opposed to in the formal work arrangement. And then the final resolution, which you touched on before, was the improvement of financial literacy for the members. And so we've seen since 2023 a significant increase. Actually, 100% of the funds that in the Pacific now have access to gender disaggregated data, whereas in 2023 there were significant gaps. For example, Cook Islands National Superannuation Fund, prior to this initiative, didn't have access to their own gender disaggregated data. But following the discussions and work with the network, they're now able to access and report on those figures.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.